I feel so relieved after realizing that I'm a highly sensitive person. Well, I think to me you seem more like an ASD. Is what? You might be autistic. Pretty similar characteristics such as HSP. And the search for understanding must go on. Better subscribe to the Understandable podcast. Since I understood that I'm a highly sensitive person, I came across that topic of autism quite often here on the internet, on YouTube, or also when talking to other highly sensitive people, to highly sensitive friends. There was an interest about that topic of autism, so I decided to do a full episode about the whole topic. And while digging into it, I came across so many confusing things about the whole topic of autism, also compared to the whole topic of high sensitivity. And today I want to dig with you a bit more into these two. So welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert. I'm a highly sensitive person, and today we talk about the topic of autism, or of the autistic spectrum, also in comparison with the spectrum of high sensitivity. After today's episode, you will understand what autism is. If you are on the autistic spectrum, if you ask yourself that a couple times, or if you stumbled across the whole topic as well, you will learn what the difference is between high sensitivity and autism, and you will also learn what unconscious masking is, which is a topic related to autism. So as I digged into these two topics a bit more, especially into autism, I found that there is a lot of confusion about high sensitivity and autism, especially when we talk about the overlap about these two worlds. And we will also go into that overlap, asking the question whether it is possible that you are, or that you're having both characteristics, being an autist and being a highly sensitive person at the same time. We'll have a look into that as well. But first of all, when I did the research, I found about some really interesting things here. I will, by the way, link all the resources, all studies, everything I came across in my research, of course, in today's episode's description. So if you want, feel free to check out the resources, definitely. According to Dr. Kim Sage, 80% of females with autism are undiagnosed. 80%. So there are so many people, I'm 100% sure also male autists, of course, who don't know about them being autistic or being on the autistic spectrum. By the way, I think the same is true for HSPs, for highly sensitive people, and I made an episode about that pretty early on when I started a podcast. Can link that up here, so check that out. While most highly sensitive people don't know that they're highly sensitive. So same is true for autists, obviously. According to her, it is also unclear that, and that causes a lot of confusion, if high sensitivity, right, is actually a type of profile of autism, or if it is a complete different thing. Dr. Ilan and Aaron, you might know her if you watched my previous episodes, my videos on this channel. She's a high sensitivity researcher, really popular one, the most popular one researcher in the field. She observed her grandnephews as highly sensitive people, but they are later on diagnosed as being autistic as well. So really interesting correlation. Obviously, there is an article about that on medium.com. I also link that in the description. And a lot of research about high sensitivity is done on white males, especially in Aaron's research, which obviously does not include other groups of society. Especially the research in women leads to a lot of confusion here when it comes to the field of autism, and a categorization of women as being highly sensitive or being female autists is extremely difficult, and as I said, causes a lot of confusion, a lot of discussion on the actual field. Let's start with some definitions that we all understand what high sensitivity actually is and what autism actually is, that you understand that. We will also, after that, go a bit more into symptoms or signs that you might be an autistic or a sensitive person. First of all, what is a highly sensitive person? And you might already know that if you watch this channel or similar or podcast regularly. So an HSP, a highly sensitive person, is someone who has a so-called sensory processing sensitivity. Short form is SPS. When we talk about HSPs, so highly sensitive people, or sensitive people, hypersensitive people, we talk about the characterization of SPS. So that is the clinical term, the medical term for what it actually means from a neurological perspective to be a highly sensitive person. A person with SPS, with a sensory processing sensitivity, has a sensitive nervous system. Where that comes from, actual science is still not 100% sure, so there are open questions. I made an episode about that, whether it is an innate trait, an innate characteristic, whether it's genetic predisposition, or if it's an adaptation to overstimulation and a really stimulating environment. I can link that episode up here. So if you want to dig more into that, where high sensitivity actually comes from, feel free to listen to this episode. What's pretty typical for a highly sensitive person is that they have a really heightened perception of the environment and of the world caused by that supersensitive nervous system. They perceive or experience a very pronounced reaction to outside stimuli, which can be, for example, bright lights. So I'm sitting here in the studio environment, I have bright lights, I'm already reacting to these, so they like really pull out the energy out of me. So it's really energy consuming to perceive these stimuli. Also can be a reaction to strong smells, to tastes, can also be a reaction to loud noises or to social stimulation as well. So that's pretty typical, these heightened reactions in highly sensitive people to environmental stimuli. Really important is that high sensitivity is not classified as a kind of disorder. And it's also true that many highly sensitive people have a lot of strengths. So they see high sensitivity more as a gift, for example, because they're really empathetic, they're really creative, they can sense details other people cannot perceive. And 20% of the population, according to, again, Elaine and Aaron, are highly sensitive. The trait, the SPS trait, is also found in 100 other species. So it's a really widespread trait that is actually displayed in a spectrum. So, for example, when you see high sensitivity as a spectrum, everyone is somewhere on that scale. When you are in the scale, like in the top 20, top 30%, you can call yourself probably someone with a heightened perception, someone with a sensory processing sensitivity. But of course, every one of us is somewhere sensitive and is somewhere on the scale. than in the top 40, top 50, top 60% of that spectrum. But not all of us have this trait expressed in that extreme form that we would call it a highly sensitive person. Then what actually is autism? So autism, now really difficult to pronounce, is a diagnosable neurodevelopmental condition. That means that you can diagnose it, and it's diagnosed as a disorder. Short form is ASD, which means autism spectrum disorder. I have to say, if I hear this kind of term, autistic spectrum disorder, yeah, to me it sounds like a kind of disease. And I also don't like the term disorder because it really puts the characteristic of being autistic in a really bad light. And you would generally think that there might be something wrong with you if you see that you have the characteristics of being on the autistic spectrum. So just keep that in mind. That's how they call it. Just keep in mind that you're fine the way you are, whatever you identify as, whatever you are, wherever you are on any spectrum of autism or high sensitivity or whatever. I think it's more helpful to see autism as not a social deficit, not a personal deficit or deficit in personality. There is nothing wrong with you, but it's a difference. You can also see it as neurodivergent. That means that your brain just works differently than, let's say, the usual brain would work. So it's not like that your brain is not working or is working in a wrong way, but it's working in a different way. So you could also see it as something special about you, which is quite nice, in my opinion. Autism also affects social communication, behavior, and sensory processing as well. But the key differences in autism are that autists have especially difficulties in social communications and interactions. They display repetitive behaviors, and they struggle a lot with changes in routines. The autistic spectrum is also quite different than the highly sensitive spectrum. You will see some similarities in that, but all in all, the spectrum is not quite linear, but you have different characteristics in the spectrum, which are expressed in different varieties and different intensifications, which may be more or less intense, varying from person to person. So your autistic spectrum will look way different than someone else's autistic spectrum. I would also think that many of us do have some autistic characteristics. When I would compare myself with someone who ranks high on the autistic spectrum, I will see some similarities. Nevertheless, I would not categorize myself as being an autist because I do not match most of the criteria, but as well I do match some of them, which also I think creates some confusion in me as well when I compare myself as being someone on the highly sensitive spectrum or ranking pretty high on the highly sensitive scale compared to someone ranking on the autistic spectrum. So let's dive into the similarities and into the differences between SPS and ASD. First of all, the similarity between those two fields, which obviously causes a lot of confusion here, especially when you compare HSP childs with autistic childs. You will see that both of them feel overstimulated from the world from time to time, so they both have that in common. Also, a large review study by Dr. Bianca Acevedo found out that there is the trait of feeling overstimulated, which is commonly found in most mental disorders. That is also summarized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the so-called DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association. So that's the similarity, that they both seem to be overwhelmed in specific situations, mostly in social situations, in social interactions with other people. And they probably both withdraw at some point. I do that as a highly sensitive person when I'm socially overstimulated, and I sense that quite clearly. For example, in the evening, after seeing a lot of people, after being in a city center, after being with someone for a long time, I sense that I need to go back, to withdraw myself, to spend time with myself to process all the stimuli, all the input. So I need this time. The difference here is that an HSP withdraws and feels overstimulated when there is too much input, when there are too many stimuli coming from the outside. The autist, on the other side, is not just overstimulated by all the stimuli addressing their nervous system, but is also in general having difficulties in social interactions and is in general confused by the observation and perception of the outside world. Now let's dig a bit more deeper into the two characteristics of high sensitivity and of ASD. First of all, let's start with the signs of being a highly sensitive person. And if you watch this channel for a longer time now, if you have watched other videos on the channel, you may have seen that I did already a couple videos on this topic for people who identify as highly sensitive people. So I will go through them now pretty quickly and summarize them, but I will link an episode up here or in the description of today's episode, which you can watch or listen to identify yourself as a highly sensitive person. For example, those 7 signs that you might be on the HSP scale or spectrum. So what is pretty characteristic for highly sensitive people is that they have high empathy and high compassion, that they are very creative. They live their creativity. They have a lot of ideas. They have a lot of interests. They have pretty strong senses, which is also caused by their sensory processing sensitivity. So a strong perception of senses, of tastes, of smells, of bright lights, of loud noises. They do have a high moral understanding, and ethics are pretty important to them. They have an enormous profoundness and depth. They have a tendency to anxiety and depression. I will also make a whole episode about that topic. They have a strong need for alone time, and they appreciate a lot the beauty of life. So aesthetics are pretty important to them. That's it for the highly sensitive person. But an autist is still different in many aspects compared to someone who is on the high sensitivity scale. So now let's go in more depth through 6 signs that you are not just a highly sensitive person, but that you may be on the autistic spectrum. I want to emphasize, as always, that personality and especially personality characteristics, personality disorder are hyper complex, and it's not always so easy to classify someone as being an autist, being a highly sensitive person, being a narcissist, being someone with complex PTSD. So it is not easy to classify human beings. Personality is never black or white. It's always some kind of spectrum in different directions, and we're all somewhere in this kind of spectrum or in these spectra. So we have many different spectra from all kinds of personal traits. That said, there will be a lot of exceptions and people who will not match these following criteria, but still being artists. So keep that in mind when you try to classify yourself or someone else while listening to, for example, a list of signs or a list of criteria of being, for example, an artist. So we start with sign number 1. A sense of calmness, self-control, and the ability to self-reflect are really difficult to you. Really interesting is brain scans show that the brains of highly sensitive people show a higher than average brain activity in the brain areas for calmness, self-control, and the ability to self-reflect. ASD brains, on the other hand, show the exact opposite. So brain scans from people who are on the autistic spectrum are having a lower than average brain activity in the exact same areas. So they experience struggles, especially with remaining calm, with self-control and the ability to self-reflect. Then we go on with sign number 2, you struggle a lot with social issues. Typical for people on the autistic spectrum is that they struggle a lot with social challenges, with social issues, with social interactions in general. On the list, for example, is eye contact. There is recognizing faces. There are verbal and non-verbal social cues and identifying and knowing the intentions of other human beings. When you're a highly sensitive person, you might also struggle a bit with social interactions, especially when you are an introvert, highly sensitive person, and I think 70% of all HSPs may be introverts, so many of you might struggle with that. But HSPs in general do not have these challenges in particular. For example, not being able to tell what the intentions of other people are. Then we go on with sign number 3. It is a challenge for you to understand what is going on emotionally in another person. There are different opinions about that sign, but in general, research says that people with ASD tend to not understand what is going on emotionally in another person, while highly sensitive people tend to be hyper aware and have a really strong empathy and compassion for other people. So it's easy for highly sensitive people to put themselves in the shoes of others, while autistic people cannot do that. And I think, of course, there will be exceptions here. And in the video, Highly Sensitive People and Autism, Dr. Kim Sage again points out that this is absolutely not true, and that there are many people with autism who are also very empathetic, who can sense a strong feeling of compassion for other human beings. So I believe that it is partly true, maybe, that if you are an artist and you struggle a lot with social interactions, especially if you struggle a lot with masking your true emotional inner world, or with over-adapting, being over-adaptive, and not showing what you actually feel, then you might feel empathy on the one hand, but not being able to show what you actually feel, to show that sense of empathy to another person. Then we go on with number 4, you struggle to regulate your emotions. This is especially true in highly sensitive children or autistic children. Sensitive children, and I can remember that pretty clearly when I was a child, I often was really emotional. So especially when I was overstimulated, when I was overwhelmed, I was really emotional. I cried a lot. I had the strong tendency to withdraw, to process my emotions. And that is pretty typical for highly sensitive people, for highly sensitive children in particular. When you have an autistic children, on the other hand, they struggle in general with emotional regulation and not just when they're overstimulated. We go on with sign number 5. you get confused by the world around you, and sometimes you feel like you do not really belong to that world we actually live in. This is again in particular true for autistic children, and I think it's also caused by the neurodivergence of autistic children, that they get confused when they perceive the world around them because they feel so misplaced and they feel so alienated. I know that highly sensitive people in particular are super aware of their world around them, while ASDs often get confused, as I said, and kind of lose themselves in the world around them. I think the feeling of being an alien and not really fitting into this world is a specific thing for both of them, which both might have in common. And then we have the sign number 6. You are drawn to narrow and really specific sets of interests. When you're a highly sensitive person, especially when you're an HSS, a so-called high sensation seeker personality, I made a video about that one, link it up here or in the description, you might have a lot of interests, a lot of hobbies, and you're often really creative and you feel like you want to try out everything. So you're in general drawn to every activity and a huge set of interests. Most highly sensitive people who are not HSS types in specific are also really creative and drawn to multiple interests, but ASDs, on the other hand, often have interests and preoccupations which are more compulsive and repetitive. That's the difference here, and that might be also arguable if that's actually true for every ASD type or for every highly sensitive person. But again, it is not about clearly classifying those both types, but it's more about seeing those two on a spectrum next to each other. So to sum up these signs, Elaine and Aaron as well as the DSM point out that there is no association between SPS and ASD. Jules DeVito, who has a nice blog about the whole topic, wrote an article which points out the same thing and comes to the same conclusion, which I also link you down in the description. But it's still arguable, as Dr. Kim Sage said, that the research of Dr. Elaine and Aaron is not completely clear here, because she based a lot of her research on the observations with her two grandnephews, which were both male, where she thought in the beginning they just might be highly sensitive people who are, in the end, both diagnosed as being autistic, and also excluding many other social groups, such as women in particular, where research obviously comes to its limits. So to conclude, it is still unclear whether high sensitivity is just a type, a form of autism, or if it is a completely different thing. Let's answer the question, which is pretty much one of the confusing things here. Can you be a highly sensitive person and an autist at the same time? And the answer is yes, definitely. So you can have the actual what science says about sensory processing sensitivity trait and being on the autistic spectrum as well. But I think you are not just an autist because you might be a highly sensitive person and match some criteria of ASD. So you see, the overlap between those two might be pretty big. So to me as well, it's pretty difficult to say whether those two might be different things or whether HSP is just a, say, variant of ASD. A typical thing many people on the autistic spectrum do from time to time, especially in social interactions, which are so difficult to them, or even during their whole lifetime, is called unconscious masking. Unconscious masking is a survival strategy, and we go more into that later, because when you think about masking, putting a mask on, then I think that's something every one of us can relate to, whether you're an artist, whether you're a highly sensitive person, whether you would not put yourself on any of these spectra. But masking is something we all do, I think. And that is true because, let's say when I talk to you now, you will just get a glimpse of my whole personality. That still means that I'm authentic when I speak to you because I just show you one authentic side of me speaking, one specific emotional state I'm delivering now to you. But do I wear a mask because of that? I don't think so, at least not consciously. So whether you think you're masking or not, you can ask yourself the question, are you authentic in that moment? Am I authentic now when I speak to you? I would say yes, because I just show how I truly am, how I truly feel in that scenario. Of course, I'm excited because I'm in front of the camera, because I'm recording an episode here, probably thousands of people will listen to one day. But I still try to be myself and show you that side of myself without putting a mask on. There are definitely differences between autistic and non-autistic people using the strategy of masking, whether it is consciously or unconsciously. But to me, when I read about it first, I thought this sounds pretty similar also to strategies highly sensitive people often do, strategies they learned in their childhood very often, which is the strategy of over-adapting. When I over-adapt as a highly sensitive person, I also do not show my truly authentic side, and I also hide specific emotions in specific interactions, mostly with other people. I'm adapting to their actual emotional state and try to not, for example, show my authentic emotional inner world. And that is what masking is pretty much as well, probably a bit different in autistic people. But summarized, it is a survival strategy for autists, and as I said, as well for other people like highly sensitive people, they learned and used. And you can imagine it as some kind of filter. So there is a filter between my true self as an artist and between the outside world. So there is some kind of wall or a curtain between how I appear and how I actually feel. They do that because they sense that there is a side in themselves they would never show anyone, and they lock in probably forever because they think there is something wrong with them. And I know that many highly sensitive people have pretty similar thoughts. So it's a really interesting strategy if you would compare masking and over-adapting here. The thing is, when someone on the autistic spectrum unconsciously masks his or her emotional inner world, let's say for their whole life, then many of them learned, and that's really interesting, to use their emotions to regulate the emotions of other people. And again, this also reminds me to over-adaptation. They use their own emotions to regulate the emotions of other people, of people they interact with. That's a clear difference between me, for example, being an empathetic person in a situation. Let's say you are crying and I see that and I sense that you are sad and I say, "Oh my dear, you look so sad, I'm so sorry." Then I'm truly mirroring your emotional world, and I will regulate your emotional state with that as well to feel you better because I mirror the compassion. That's a different thing than actually regulating emotions of someone else by masking. When I do mask, say same situation, you cry, you feel sad, you feel bad, and I feel overwhelmed by that, then I mask and you will see me smiling. You will see me, hey, that's fine, everything is great. You will be happy, trying to regulate your emotional state by putting a mask on, especially if the person wants to hide his true empathy or his true emotion in that scenario. Same thing happens the other way around. Let's say you are in the autistic spectrum and you interact with someone, and the other person is in a really good mood. The other person is really happy, is smiling. You're not. You do feel really sad that day. You do feel like you just don't want to interact. So what you're doing is you do not want the other person to feel that you feel bad. So you put that mask on, you smile because you want to regulate the state of the other person. The other person remains in that happy state because you pretend that you also are in that really good state, but you're actually not. That is masking. So you're actually hiding parts of your personality. For example, can be emotions like sadness, can be emotions like anxiety, can be emotions like anger, could be anything, could be some specific trait, preferences, whatever. You feel like you have to hide from the outside world, from other people, but you regulate by putting that mask on. And you're not just regulating yourself, but you're also regulating the other person. And that is definitely a two-sided coin here. Because on the one hand, masking is a learned survival strategy. For example, for a neurodivergent person, for someone who has experienced the world way differently than most of us do, this is probably an existential survival strategy they learned. So it's easy to say, just stop masking. But on the other hand, it's a pretty dangerous strategy because if you suppress your authentic needs, your authentic being, whatever you feel, sense, whatever parts of your personality you would push away, if you do that for your whole life, suppress these parts of your personality, then you are technically lying to the people you interact with. And I know, even if that's just a survival strategy, if that's a good thing for you in that moment, is extremely difficult because what's the possible consequence here? And what you see very often, especially in relationships with other people, friendships, family relationships, romantic relationships, you can observe these things happening. At some point, you can't hold it anymore, and then you just cut the contact from one day to another. And people do not know why, because you seemed so well all the time in the relationship. You were masking for years, maybe for decades. And at some point, the pressure will be too high and you will explode or you will implode. You will need to withdraw if you're not able to put down the mask. And that is true not only for people on the autistic spectrum, but also for highly sensitive people, for people who are not able to communicate their needs, for everyone who is suppressing parts of their authentic personality. To sum it up, what to do when you identify as a highly sensitive person, or now in that scenario as an ASD, as a person being on the autistic spectrum. I want to make clear one thing, because we talked a lot about issues, challenges, about struggles in today's episode. And as an HSP, I empathize a lot with everyone of you out there listening or watching to today's episode who now identifies as an ASD. That's especially true because ASD is labeled as a disorder, and I said in the beginning of the episode that I'm struggling with that term of classifying something or someone with a specific trait as a disorder or having a disorder. So to me, it sounds pretty bad. It sounds that there is something wrong with you, and that's not true. That's not the case. So I want to make clear here that it's not good or bad whether you're an HSP or an ASD, because we all have different perceptions of the world. We all have different realities, how we perceive reality, because our perception equals our reality. And if you would call yourself neurodivergent, or if you would call yourself neurologically normally, doesn't matter in the end. It's not just black or white. You're totally okay the way you are, whatever label you put on yourself or whatever label someone else put on you. It doesn't matter if it's called a disorder or a personality trait. I think in the end it comes down to what you actually can do to make your life more fulfilled and to use your personal traits and characteristics to make your life more successful and what to strive for in this world we actually live in this society we actually live in. I think what's really important here is what I want to mention, because I experienced that myself. I know other people who are on the HSP spectrum or on the ASD spectrum who also would agree with that, and that is that the both types would definitely benefit from therapy, and there are definitely options to get support whatever trait you live with. For example, highly sensitive people can definitely learn strategies to find their way through the over-arousal, to communicate their needs in a better way, and to definitely learn how to set better boundaries and distance themselves from time to time without the feeling of guilt or shame. ASDs, on the other hand, can definitely learn strategies to address their social communication skills, their behavior, as well as their sensory processing. And whether you are an HSP or an ASD, I'm really thankful that you listened to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, definitely make sure to subscribe to the podcast here on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you listen to. Also check out the books in the description. What do you think about the whole topic of ASD and HSP? Let me know in the comments, and I see and speak to you in the next episode.